and then turning around and then try to make money, oftentimes making the product experience way worse, like Uber or DoorDash or Netflix, because wait, our user behaviors are already set. We already signed up for all these things. We don't have cable anymore. We cut cable, so you can fuck us all over because we have no option. Now, I'm not saying Kick is going to make their experience terrible when they try to become profitable, but it is not that weird to be in a growth phase. How are they funding this growth phase? They haven't gone for several rounds of VC funding, but luckily, a lot of the people who are on the board at Kick are also on the board at Stake.com.
Hey, it's me again. It's just me, you guy. What the fuck? From haunted houses to roller coasters, we humans have been looking for reliable ways to scare ourselves since we started feeling emotion. There's some innate human desire for adrenaline and fear-based activities, so long as it's safe. Simulating murderers chasing us or falling to our death has been a staple of the entertainment industry since forever ago. I love roller coasters. I love haunted houses. I love reveling in that feeling of being scared. The feeling we really only get when faced with some terrifying primal sense of danger. And reliably replicating that in a safer environment is a lot more exhilarating than terrifying. And a consistent way that we've been feeling this exhilaration since fucking forever ago has always been going to the movies. Horror movies have been through so many different eras and different trends and cinematic cliches and things like that, but I would argue right now, they're the most popular they've ever been. Thanks to companies like A24 or Blumhouse, modern studios are realizing the monetary potential of making similarly exhilarating experiences. And those are the dominant horror studios nowadays, but companies have been making horror movies since forever ago, dude. They're a reliable way to make something incredibly cheap and then just exponentially profit off of it forever. Most horror movies have small casts, they have dark lighting, they don't really have a need for heavy special effects usage. They're the cheapest movies to make through and through, which I think is why it's such a popular genre for indie directors to tackle. When you think about indie movie, it's either an indie coming-of-age drama or an indie horror movie because they're incredibly cheap to make and they can lead to extravagant profits, dude. We've seen larger budget horror movies, but I think the reason companies keep making horror movies in the first place is because they can reliably put butts in seats for 2 cents. I mean, think about the Blair Witch Project. That movie is now one of the most iconic and recognizable horror properties in existence, and it was made for 60 grand. Ridiculously low when you think about the fucking revenue that movie generated, bro. 60 grand? It's nothing. Companies have been making horror movies forever, but horror movies themselves have gone through a lot of different eras and trends as filmmaking itself has cinematically evolved over time. For instance, the A24 psychological thrillers of today are way different than the horror slashers of the 1980s. In fact, the 1980s might be the best place to start. Okay, look, there are eras of horror that are before the 1980s. It's not like horror movies began in the 1980s. Rosemary's Baby, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Big horror movies existed before 1980. I'm not making that claim. I'm just saying that I think the most recognizable movement in the genre comes from the slasher movies of the 1980s. In my opinion, going back and watching a lot of these movies now is a fucking chore. Because filmmaking has evolved to such an extent in the past 50 years where these movies now seem kind of silly and dated. Take Friday the 13th, for instance. That's one of the most recognizable horror properties of all time. And that first movie is one of the worst movies I have ever fucking seen. For 90 minutes, you watch different pairs of camp counselors team up, go off into the woods to fuck each other, and then they get murdered by a mask-wearing freak. Sounds kind of enticing if executed properly, but the cheapness of everything going on here is so apparent. There's almost zero effort put in on a filmmaking front. Dude, look at this shit. This woman. Okay, this is the main character. Why? What is this? What is the purpose of this shot, dude? This is 10 minutes into the fucking movie. Where, like, what? Do we need to see her walk across this whole fucking street, bro? Where is she going? What the fuck is happening? And the worst part about it is that it isn't even fucking scary. Watching it nowadays, it's like a fucking nostalgia trip for a time I wasn't even born in. It's a hard pass from me, is what I'm saying. And to tell the truth, I feel the same way about a lot of its counterparts. Nightmare on Elm Street is the same deal. Some raggedy fucker chasing down people until he dies to some bullshit and then the movie ends. Look, these movies are clearly inspired by the 70s slasher movements that predate them. You know, like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These movies are actually halfway decent movies that understand the horror formula a lot more than their fucking little brother counterparts. Maybe the combination of like Reaganomics and a booming entertainment industry was like the perfect storm for like horror movies to be nothing more than like cheap wastes of time in the 1980s. But there are a few like genuinely good cinematic efforts, I think, from this era. For starters, I think there's a trend of anti-horror, for lack of a better term, in the 1980s. Movies that take inherently scary concepts that nowadays would probably be like a 90-minute A24 psychological thriller. But back in the 1980s, they were just allowed to be like silly summer blockbusters. These are movies like Ghostbusters and Gremlins. Movies that aren't scary in the slightest, honestly, but translate these more kind of horror-based themes into like digestible cinema for audiences everywhere to enjoy. And these movies are caked in the filmmaking techniques of the 1980s. And going back and watching both of them now, they're okay, they're kind of dated, but I think there is something to be said about these weird, sillier attempts at horror movies that are born out of the 1980s that we don't really get a lot of anymore today. There are only a couple smaller movies from this era that I think are actually effective on like a horror level, but if there's one movie that defines this era while also being a genuinely entertaining and good movie to watch today, I think there's only really one place you need to look. Breaking news, this movie is fucking gas. The Thing is a perfect example of a movie with this storybook coziness of the 80s, and it's still like an insanely tense, dramatic time. Professional YouTuber, by the way. The blood testing scene alone is enough to put Hitchcock fanboys to shame. Fuck you, I'm 14, and so is my taste. But this movie's doing a lot of really special things throughout its runtime that contribute to that tenseness. Horror movies from this era rely on ensemble casts that are being slowly killed one by some kind of entity. Almost every single horror movie from this time follows that formula, including the shitty ones that I mentioned earlier, especially the shitty ones that I mentioned earlier. And The Thing is another movie that follows this formula to a T, but what separates it from these other shitty movies is its villain and its setting. Most of these shitty slasher movies from the 80s take place in like suburbia, or a summer camp, or any place you can gather a bunch of teenagers in one space and have it be believable. And The Thing takes place on a remote research base in Antarctica. It's perfect. Alien is another great example from a horror movie around this. I'm cheating a little bit. It's 79. I'm a year away. Just let me have it. Alien's another great example because it takes place on a fucking spaceship of all places, bruh. That's like as far away from suburbia as you can get. And both of these settings are great, awesome, cool, fun stuff. 2 thumbs up from me. But what makes these movies work more so than anything are the unique alien life forms that they each have as their villains. All of these other movies revolve around some humanoid fucker killing everybody, and their motivation is just usually that they're evil. Jason's mom is fulfilling a decades-long grudge that doesn't even make sense anymore. Michael Myers is an escaped killer. Freddy Krueger is just like evil, I guess. These are really low-hanging motivations for your fucking movie villain. I mean, I guess that makes sense considering how thrown together a lot of these movies from the 80s are, but that makes a movie like Alien or The Thing that much scarier, in my opinion. Because the villains in these movies have the exact same motivation as the protagonists, to just survive the encounter. The inherent, like, bestial nature of them makes them that much scarier compared to a fucking pruned grandfather who eats dreams. The Thing rose above this horror formula that had been set, is the point I'm making. It still followed it to some extent, but it took creative risks with its setting and its villain, which really bolstered these themes of like isolation and paranoia running rampant throughout the movie. It's basically just the first game of Among Us ever played. But if you haven't seen this movie by now, it's so fucking worth it, dude. It needs to be seen at least once before you die. As does Alien. These movies rely a lot more on their characters and their stories than their fucking gore fest bullshit. So when something actually scary and gory happens, it's that much scarier because it makes sense within the context of the narrative. Hello, film student? And it's not just another pointless killing of a girl with her tits out, is the point. for the 17th time. I fucking hate Friday the 13th. For my generation, most of these movies are the movies that our parents grew up watching and enjoying. I remember my mom telling me when she watched The Exorcist as a kid in the 70s that it scarred her for life. And 50 years later, the filmmaking techniques have evolved to a point where I'm sure that was scary in the 1970s, but watching that movie nowadays, it's a lot more funny than frightening. And the best part is that in 50 years, people are going to be saying the exact same things about the horror movies that I love and grew up watching. And isn't that just the beauty of filmmaking? Let's move on to the next era. You think they'll notice if I keep the same shot but just change clothes? We'll see. I like being in this corner. Fuck you. It's kind of like Finnegan's News Corner. Dun, 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 dun. Welcome back to breaking news. Stills of Joker 2 Menage a Trois just released. The 1990s. I was not born. The 90s are a really interesting decade for horror movies, I think, because it's really hard to quantify the trends and cliches of this decade compared to the one that came prior, because we have wholeheartedly moved past the slasher movement of the 1980s, and we're starting to get movies that are parodies of those movies, like Scream. And simultaneously, we're getting these small inklings of what makes horror movies so popular nowadays, that being these kind of more character-focused psychological thrillers that A24 are so well known for. And I think the Blair Witch Project is a great example of this. I personally think this movie is overrated, sorry, but I think it's a great mirror into what we value in these kinds of movies today as well. This movie is almost entirely about its three main characters, which is what a lot of horror movies today pride themselves on, that being more character-focused, character study type cinema. It doesn't even have that many jump scares in it. Something that we are thankfully moving away from as we realize how cheap of a fucking scare tactic the jump scare is. It's a lot less physical horror and it's a lot more psychological horror. Like Gaslight and ADHD, psychological horror has completely lost its meaning today because everything's a psychological horror. Fucking my favorite psychological horror movie? Alright, my point is, in the 90s, we're starting to see a purposeful movement away from this overdone slasher genre of the 1980s, and now we're getting a lot of movies that are basically dramas with horror elements. The Blair Witch Project is a great example of this transition, but I think another great example of this transition is a movie like Misery. Misery, movie about an author who gets kidnapped by his biggest fan, forced to write his books in the confines of her house. Again, super character-focused, basically a drama with a few horror elements here and there. The fun, silly side of horror that Scream represents in the 1990s, also a really interesting movement, but neither of these movements could have happened without the slasher movement because they act as responses to it. Whether it's satirizing slasher movies or just kind of purposely moving away from the filmmaking techniques that defined them, the 1990s represent this paradigm shift in the way that audiences viewed horror movies. Because now there's a lot more focus on character development and plot structure, putting the movie before the horror. And I think there is one big, massive, huge movie that exemplifies this shift perfectly. Billed as the first horror movie to win an Oscar, The Silence of the Lambs is one of the most praised movies in the film canon ever. And I think the reason why this movie's still talked about as a horror movie instead of like a drama slash thriller kind of movie is the way it creates suspense. Whether it's the iconic night vision sequence at the end of the movie or literally any time Anthony Hopkins opens his fucking deranged mouth, this movie's doing a lot of things to keep audiences paranoid and on the edge of their seats the entire time. I think more so than anything though, the main difference between Silence of the Lambs and these other shitty horror movies, aside from being a genuinely good movie in the first place, is the uncomfortable amount of time that it makes us spend with its main villain. Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, all of these people are faceless nobodies, really, whose dialogue is written straight from the cringe dimension itself. Hannibal Lecter is given monologues. He's given an uncomfortable amount of close-ups throughout the movie. It's because of these little filmmaking techniques and an absolutely banger performance from Anthony Hopkins that we will never forget, that I think that character remains so frightening today. Like I said before, this movie is a lot more of a drama than a horror movie, but that is exactly the kind of shift that was needed in the 1990s in order to keep horror movies alive. Audiences were markedly tired of this 1980s slasher horror movement. It's why movies like Scream did so fucking well. And it's also why, comparatively, movies like Child's Play, the fucking Chucky movies, or Hellraiser and all this shit in the later 80s didn't do as well as Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street in the early 80s. People get tired. Genres get oversaturated. We're experiencing that very thing right now with the superhero genre. People are tired. The genre is oversaturated. Marvel only releases one halfway decent movie a year in the sea of disappointment. Things aren't what they used to be. And in the 1990s, things needed to change. And movies like Silence of the Lambs, Misery, Blair Witch Project, Scream, these were the breaths of fresh air that the genre needed to keep it fucking alive. And these movies are all cool, and they did wonderful things for horror movies, but unfortunately, they led us into maybe the worst decade for horror movies ever. The 2000s were the worst era for horror movies by far. This is when we return to that meeting of capitalism and entertainment that we saw in the 1980s. Movies being made for $2, making $2 billion, and then repeating the cycle ad nauseum until audiences get tired. The poster boy for these kinds of movies in the 2000s, I would say, one of the worst horror franchises of all time and where creativity goes to die. I am, of course, talking about Paranormal Activity. Paranormal Activity is representative of, like, everything wrong with horror in the 2000s. For starters, it was made for $15,000. That's a quarter of the Blair Witch budget, and that movie was made like a decade before this one. Cheap budgets in and of themselves aren't a bad thing. What is bad is studios exploiting how cheap this kind of filmmaking is to produce in order to make less and less profits every time on like a dozen movie franchise. Paranormal Activity 1 was a huge success. Huge! The movie is boring as fuck. The characters are insanely annoying, and it isn't even fucking scary, and it was still one of the biggest movies of 2007. And on a $15,000 budget, it grossed $200 million. What? Now you see why all these studios had fucking dollar signs in their eyes, bro. That's a ridiculous turnaround. There are now 7 Paranormal Activity movies. I don't know how much money they've made, but I can imagine it's a fuck ton. The point is, this business practice was commonplace in horror in the 2000s. It wasn't just Paranormal Activity that was guilty of exploiting the market like this. Horror movies kind of fell into a recession where everything coming out was like creatively bankrupt because studios just saw like the opportunity to churn out fat profits. Paranormal Activity, fucking Insidious. This leads to like the Conjuring movies in the 2010s, which those movies suck. I can't believe people like those movies. The Saw movies, which are actually kind of fun, but they're on their like 15th Saw movie at this point, and I'm not gonna pretend like it isn't just a fucking cash grab series now. A lot of really shitty remakes around this time. 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, one of the first movies I watched high, and even then I was like, this is atrocious. Like all these other eras, there were a few horror movies that stand out above the rest and are actually like pretty good, but this era is characterized by a return to capitalistic greed in like studio filmmaking. The two main movies that I've seen that I would say rise above the rest of these horror movies, even though I fucking struggle to call them horror movies, 28 Days Later and Cloverfield. But again, I struggle to call these movies horror movies. Just because they revolve around zombies and monsters doesn't automatically make them a horror movie. If you look up any list of horror movies in the 2000s, these movies are going to be on there. And maybe I'm just arbitrarily drawing lines in the sand for whatever exercise I'm doing, but like, they do use horror elements to scare their audiences, that's for sure. 28 Days Later is just like a really good zombie movie, probably the best zombie movie that I've seen, I think, yeah. And it definitely deals with the horrors of a situation like that, but this movie is so much more about the characters than it is about the zombies. Something which I can't really say about movies like Night of the Living Dead. Shit sucks. Cloverfield is also like a really good movie for its genre. It's fucking stupid, but it's so fun, dude. It is scary at times. I still think about what happens to Lizzie Kaplan in this movie, dude. Jesus Christ. But it is more of like a monster movie than anything. I wouldn't call Godzilla a horror movie. Maybe genres mean different things to different people. Maybe this is redundantly drawing lines in the sand, like I said. But there are always a few movies of each era that take the like a previously established foundation from other eras and like take that formula and creatively experiment on it to make something new and cool. The 2000s and the 1980s are both characterized by this unyielding relationship between filmmaking and capitalism. Studios exploiting how cheap these movies are to make in order to make a franchise where it's still insanely profitable 8 or 9 movies into the franchise. And at the beginning of the 2010s, this was still a really common business practice. Today, it's still a really common business practice. Movies need to make money. But in my opinion, the 2010s were the best decade for horror in the history of cinema. I miss the raid. Where's my script? Give me my script. I need my script. I miss the raid. Maybe I'm fucking biased. This is the only cinematic decade that I've like fully lived through, but I still think I have enough rhetorical ground to stand on when I call this decade, or the 2010s at least, the best decade for horror movies in the history of cinema. Between a few key directors and what A24 was able to establish in a very short amount of time, I think this decade has revolutionized the way we view horror movies. Let's start with A24. Every film bro's favorite movie studio. It's the reason your annoying film major friend, me included, wanted to be a film major in the first place. But to deny their legacy is just dishonest, dude. The amount of actually experimental and creative horror movies that have been coming out over the past decade has exponentially increased. And I think that is, in part, due to the fact that studios like A24 are taking more creative risks on these smaller directors instead of just cashing in on whatever cinematic trends are popular at the time. Fucking guy. I think a great example of this is the career of somebody like Robert Eggers. From The Witch to The Lighthouse to The Northman, A24 has let Eggers' imagination run wild, and he's made back-to-back-to-back bangers. And again, these aren't really horror movies. They're dramas that redefines what it even means to be a horror movie. And so many more movies like these are helping with that redefinition. That's why I think there's such a revolution going on in horror cinema right now. And that's just one career made up of 3 movies that A24 has contributed to. This isn't even mentioning It Comes at Night, Green Room, classic, Climax. I fucking love Climax, dude. Literally anything by Yorgos Lanthimos. Saint Maud, which low-key sucks, sorry. Or even like Under the Skin. What a weird fucking movie. Kind of bangs, though. There are so many new and creative horror movies coming out thanks to studios like A24 who are willing to take these new creative risks. They're not even creative risks anymore, dude. A24 have cemented themselves as one of the biggest names working in movies today. They just produced the movie that's likely gonna be the biggest movie of the decade. Like, they're not the little indie no-name studio taking creative risks on no-name directors anymore. Everybody knows A24, so much so that it's become the new popular thing to hate on them. Which happens with any popular thing, I guess. Maybe there's a video to be made about this. I think it's so awesome that this late into filmmaking's journey, we're still getting these crazy cinematic movements that redefine what it means to be a genre. And all of these movies that I've just mentioned and many more go into making this revolution possible in the first place. But I genuinely think this horror boom of the 2010s would not have been possible, or at least would not have gone to the extent that it did, were it not for the introduction of 2 very, very important movies that I've yet to mention. Hereditary and Midsommar are the epitome of what I'm talking about. Genre filmmaking techniques being revolutionized and thought about in different ways today. The fact that one dude in his 30s was able to make 2 of the most highly respected horror movies in the film canon back to back, it's insane. And I think it's a great testament to the creative and experimental new direction that we're moving in with horror movies today. And I would argue a similar movement is happening in animation with the release of another 2 very special movies, but that's a different video entirely. I think these movies are the perfect blend of like experimental horror techniques and like being a good movie that the general public would want to watch. I was 16 when I watched Hereditary for the first time, and I remember viscerally how off-put I was by that movie compared to other horror movies. The way this movie tries to scare you is so much more offbeat and eerie as opposed to just like jump scare city. There are things in the background that you might not even notice, but add an entire layer of terror to what you're watching. I've seen this movie 6 times now, I think. Every single time I've watched it, I've come out with some new thing that I've found about it. A lot of the horror here is hidden in the details of the movie, which is why when it comes to that explosive of a climax, it's that much scarier. Midsommar's scary in a different way. It's definitely a testament to Ari Aster's ability to make movies, that he's able to make one of the most harrowing movies just in a really bright and colorful and fun setting. And I think a really interesting part of these movies is the fact that they still follow this formula for horror set up by the slasher movements of the 80s. Full circle, fuck you, I'm a video essayist. It's still an ensemble of characters dying one by one to some spooky entity or group or gimmick or whatever. Only now these movies aren't just blood and boobs. They're vehicles to talk about grief and trauma and familial loss, and there's still 5 frighteningly scary movies on top of that. Filmmaking is always in a constant state of flux. It's always evolving. And with this evolution, genres have to evolve in different ways too. Some genres underwent very little changes over the past 50 years. I would argue the drama, it has still has like the core filmmaking principles of like 40 and 50 years ago. But other genres like horror have had to evolve entirely and completely change how we view it in order to entice audiences back into seats. I think Hereditary and Midsommar are actively responding to this evolution of cinema. They realize that they come after long lines of different eras of movies and have a lot of movies that are traceable up to this point in filmmaking's journey. And I think it takes a lot of these creative risks as a result of this evolution. I don't know, maybe I'm just talking out of my ass, just saying shit. It's certainly how it feels when I write the scripts for these videos. It's just like blah 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 word jargon. Does anybody fucking care? Hopefully somewhere in there's like some kind of analysis that works. I don't know. Let's move on to my final topic. There's this picture that goes viral on Twitter every few months. At least I see it on my timeline every few months. And it's a behind the scenes picture of Jordan Peele's latest movie, Nope. It's a behind the scenes picture of when the alien life form rains a bunch of like blood and belongings on the house. This one picture shows more cinematic effort than was ever put into something like Friday the fucking 13th. To me, Jordan Peele's new trilogy of horror movies kind of encapsulates everything that I've been talking about so far. All of these movies are about far more than the villains and the kills that happen. They're about the narrative and the characters and the plot structure, something far more intricate than the drivel of the 80s. Get Out exploded when it came out, and for good reason too. Obviously, everyone was impressed with his ability as a comedian to tackle like a serious horror property, but when that movie came out, that kind of refreshing horror experience was like super hard to find replicated elsewhere. My favorite of these three movies will always be Nope. I fucking love that movie. It's quickly become one of my new favorites. But I think all three of these movies have cinematic ground to stand on. All of these movies take characters that we actually care about and force them to confront actually scary concepts. Whether it's aliens or doppelgangers or white people, these villains are always so much more than just your simple slasher villain. They're vehicles for Jordan Peele to say whatever he wants about the complex nature of race and fucking spectacle and Lupita Nyong'o. My point here is that these movies and the new batch of A24 horror movies are good omens for the future of horror. This decade itself is shaping up to be another banger of a horror decade too, continuing the cool, creative, experimental trends that we've seen in the last decade. Lots and lots of talented people are releasing horror-based stuff right now. Fucking Jordan Peele, like I said, but there's also Brandon Cronenberg, Julia Ducournau. We just saw two fucking YouTubers turn a horror movie into one of the best movies of the year. The future of horror is looking positive. Thumbs up from me. And I think as time goes on, we're only gonna get more and more studios that try to break the cinematic mold like A24 did. And hopefully this means that any genre can be saved. We are incredibly overdosed on superhero movies right now, but cinema goes through trends like that. We were overdosed on Western movies like 80 years ago, and look at the Western movies we have now. They're fucking awesome. And maybe in a decade or so, the few superhero movies we'll get a year will be like rom-coms or character studies or whatever kind of cinematic response that it has to this overdose that we're experiencing right now. I mean, we clearly just saw the same with horror movies, cinematic trends that arise out of a response to other cinematic trends. It's just the ever-evolving nature of filmmaking. Okay. I'm done. I think my thesis after all of this, thank you eternally, by the way, as always, is Scooby-Doo 2 Monsters Unleashed clears all of these movies, dude. Have a good one.